David Vizard here, and you, my friends, are watching PowerTec 10. If you can give me 20 or 30 minutes of your time, I promise you that you will get the benefits of my now 60 plus years of working on and doing development projects on high performance and race engines. So, in just 20 minutes, you can pack in some knowledge that will be something that I may have spent years getting. So it's a good shortcut to methods for making more power. Let me remind you, this is the channel where we try to absolutely minimize the BS, and we try to straighten out misconceptions and things like this. We also reveal the big time BSers and poor products. We go for the throat on those companies or individuals who are so far off reality that you need to be told. This is episode 102, and our subject material is varied here. The principal thing I want to talk about is tricks of the trade for road racing under adverse conditions, i.e. pouring rain or not too much grip, or you've got the slowest car out there and you've got to make up for it somehow. Slowest not because you're bad at prepping the car, but because everything else has got more motor than you've got. Anyway, before we get to that, I want to make a few announcements. I guess the first one I should make is, I got my check back from Apex. I don't believe they sent it straight away like they said they did, because it took 2 weeks to get here by special delivery. Next on the list, I've just come back from an episode up at Terry's and left the dyno cell pleased about the results of our Street 632. We kind of swapped the way we did this here. It essentially is a Street 632 with some AFR 24 degree heads, that's the regular street heads, 325cc ports. They might say that's a bit small for a 632 inch big block. But here is our goal. Usually when we build a street motor, we build it as a 10.5 to 1 motor because we know we can run pump gas. We know how to run pump gas 10.5 to 1. However, to get the power from it, we have to maximize what we do with the cam. Now that doesn't mean we end up with a race cam, but it means we end up with a big cam, and we may be sacrificing some low end horsepower for top end. Maybe. What we did this time is a little different. We used a street cam and a race compression ratio. Now you might say, well, that means we're going to put race gas in it all the time. Yes, but let's consider this. You'll have a motor that, well, the idea was, could we make it pull? Yes, we did. Just not going to tell you the results we got, but they were pretty damn good. To show that it's not a race engine power curve in terms of the curve and the broad spec of the torque it makes, it idles at 850 to 870 RPM. Good as gold. Be a couple of issues from now. Watch what we did to it. And by the way, it's up for sale. This motor has everything on it. Dry sump, crank trigger, pro stock type distributor on it. The whole 9 yards. Idles like it's a pussycat purring. Next, and this is my next article, at least I think it is, it's pretty close to it. A 427 inch small block Ford Windsor, courtesy of DSS, Trick Flow Specialties, and Terry Walters engines. Right now, all of this was a project I took on, and then I had all my medical problems and all that. And these companies kind of took over to make sure things could still happen. That's next. Now this is an 87 octane fuel motor, 427 inches. Put it in your truck and drive around America. It made just on 1.4 foot-pounds per cube. Very good, by the way, for the displacement. And 707 horsepower. It's also for sale. It's a much simpler engine than our big block, and I think you'll agree that the price that Terry's asking for it, which I'll announce, it's well worth the money. It didn't happen overnight. We tweaked this, tweaked that, tweaked something else, and got it to behave very much like a street motor, but with near race engine performance. Lastly, before I get to the meat and bones of this video, I want to say that I have the solution to a big block Chevy carburation problem which has plagued me for years. Let me explain. If you want a big block to breathe well, you need a dominator and a good intake manifold such as the Sniper Junior, or a single plane manifold of any other type. But the one manifold you can't rely on to produce power is the typical two-plane manifold. Now Edelbrock's got a very good two-plane manifold. So what's my grouse here? Well, it only takes a 4150 size carb. So you've got this manifold which flows very well. You stick the carb on it, kills it dead. What I'm kind of a bit ticked off is that the solution to this has been in front of me for years and I've just never spotted it. Here's the deal. I've got the answer for it, and I'm going to do a big block induction system video that will go through what manifolds do what they need, and what we should be looking at, and why companies aren't making it that way. So that's down the road. So I will be trying to, how shall I say, cajole at least one intake manifold manufacturer into making an intake manifold for a single carb the way I suggest, not the way they're doing it. Let's see how that turns out. Now for the original subject material of this feature. Things to do to get around the track faster that may not be obvious. Here's the number one. In a couple of editions of PowerTec 10, I mentioned that I would often do a modification and then forget why I'd done it, because that's now water under the bridge. It's like, what's the next one? Well, I remember there was one that I did to the handbrake, and I said, oh, we took time off our lap time around Silverstone's club circuit. And I said, I'm pretty sure it was about 0.2 of a second. Well, that may have been the case for a dry track, but it could be as much as a second on a wet track. So how do you modify a handbrake to make it work better? Simple. Now I remember it. It's simple. It's racking my brains for this. Now, this mod only works for a rear-wheel drive car that has an open diff. At the time I was racing what we call production sedans in England, so it was a showroom stock deal. No diff. Anyway, here's what you do. Let's say you go around a tight bend and you're really pushing it. What happens is the inside rear wheel spins and you don't accelerate. It's just spinning, it's just going bzzz on the road like this, and it doesn't give you any drive off the corner. Well, allowing the fact that nearly all corners on a racetrack turn right, on a road course that is, not an oval track. And unless there's a crossover somewhere on the track, you turn 360 degrees more to the right than you do to the left. Obviously, if there's a crossover, cars go under, around, and then it's equal. They turn the same amount of degrees both ways. So, knowing that the inside wheel is likely to spin, what I did was I cut the ratchets so that they, when I pulled the handbrake on, what it did was to apply the brake to the inside wheel, the one that spun. So I would pull the handbrake up so that it and adjust the cables so that no brake on the outside wheel, but some on the inside wheel. So when I went round a corner and the wheel started spinning, I would just dab the brake. Now the brake didn't go to the drive wheel, it went to the wheel that was spinning. Now what an open diff does is it equals the torque between the two wheels. So now that wheel thought that it was getting some grip because it was having to work harder to turn the wheel. So what it did was it locked up the diff, so it drove the other wheel. So whilst everyone was going bzzz around the hairpin, David went round with no wheel spin. You should have seen the gap I pulled on them. I also found it worked in the dry. Now again, some wet performance here. If you're going to race in the wet, first off, you need to find out what tire works, and that is costly and time absorbing, right? But it's worth it. I found some tires that worked. I wasn't the only one using them, but I was the only one making the most of them. And what you need to do for a wet tire is cut out some of the tread. It needs to be almost like a knobbly, but not quite. Then when you've done that, you pump the tire up to about 50 psi for the wet. And what that does is it sweeps the water away from your tire much better. Now let me say something about treaded tires on the wet versus slicks on the wet. Most people think that as soon as the track gets a bit wet, they need to change tires. Not so. You would be surprised how far you can go with a slick on a track which is getting wet. What a slick won't do is sweep water away. However, if there is no running water there and there's always road surface sticking through any water that's on the track, a slick will almost certainly do better than a treaded tire. Just make a note of that. What else do I have to tell you about? Oh yes, here's something else that's quite important. If you're on a track which is predominantly turning fast bends to the right, shave off the right hand side tires so that they're smaller. In other words, you are going to have stagger. Doesn't have to be much. What we would do if we were on a dry road, we would shave the inside tire about 1/8 more than we shaved the outside tire. Now we shave the tires always. Why? Because you can't get a tire to run concentric right off the shelf. Doesn't happen. Now, expensive tires may do that these days, but 30 years ago, they didn't do that. They always had a bit of run out. Now, if you've got a bit of run out in the tire, it's like having a wheel out of balance. It's going to go, or you're driving over a bumpy road. It's going to go from grip, less grip, grip, less grip, grip, less grip, but much faster than I can tell you. So, have the tires skimmed. If they're very much eccentric when you put them on, reject them. There's something wrong with them, right? They're molded wrong. You have every right to take them back to where you bought them and say, these tires are not running concentric. I want another set put on that do. And no matter how much they argue, if they're more than maybe like 1/8 of an inch out, they better be replacing them or you threaten to sue them for selling you a dangerous tire. That works every time. Now let's get down to some other things here. I think I told you about the one where I machined my brake discs so that they had a wave in them. I haven't made a big deal about this because when you do this to the brakes, and if you're a late braker like I am, when you put the brakes on, you have no chance of seeing where you're going, right? The whole lot is blur. So you have to know when to put the brakes on and when to take them off without you can see when to put them on. What you can't see is when to take them off. You have to know. Well, how much difference did it make? My God, no one could even stay with me braking into a corner. That's how come I got this reputation for king of the late breakers. I mean, we'd get somebody who was a previous or current leading the championship, put the brakes on, and I'd go by them flat out in whatever gear I was in at the time, or even shifting up. They couldn't believe it. It's like, oh, Vizard's going to kill himself on this bend. Go round the bend. How the hell did that happen? Those brakes. So read that. It's brake shake. That was it. I can't remember the issue. It was brake shake. Go and read it, and it will tell you what I did. Now, still on the subject of brakes, here's another one that you should pay attention to, because I know this works. I've done it for years, but it's not advised by all the brake manufacturers and hose manufacturers. First, other than for safety reasons, it's not a good idea to use hard hoses from the brake caliper to whatever the fitment is on the body of the car. In other words, the last hoses. Rubber ones work better. You know why? Because the hard hoses are too severe. When you put the brake on, it's either on or off. They cut the modulation. This business about, oh, feel how hard that pedal is. Believe it or not, that's not what you want. You might think you want it, but no. Having a cushion in the system is much better. Now, there are people who've made up brake systems which have a cylinder in there which gives the pedal a softer feel so that you modulate the brakes better. But you can do the same thing by not putting the hard deals on. Now, when we were doing the British Touring Car Championship, the rules said you had to use armoured hoses. Well, I got hold of the tech inspector and I said, look, we can't compress hardened hoses to be able to change a back axle, which is the easiest way to change the rear end ratio for the track. So I said, could we have inside the car regular rubber hoses so that we can clamp it off and use the armoured hoses at the exposed ends either end? Oh yeah, sure, that's fine. Well, that got me two great advantages there. The first one was I could actually go faster. I tried it round Brands Hatch. There was over a half a second difference. A half a second. Now, I didn't get this reputation for being a good late breaker because of any skill I might have had. And I think I do have a skill at braking late, because it doesn't matter what car I drove, I seemed to brake later than the driver that had it. But I would encourage other people, oh, you need to get your pedal really hard. Right, which is exactly the reverse of what you actually wanted, but it looked like it was good because everybody else seemed to recognize the fact that you should have a hard pedal. Should have, which is wrong. The other aspect that I found that this took care of is that I now had a regular style rubber hose in the car. Now, the rules said the car should not be equipped with a line lock. They didn't say anything about the driver being equipped with one. Now, in my pocket I had a pair of vice grips which had rounded ends on. Now, I had the interior brake cable wrapped in electrical insulation, and it went into the console, and it looked like it was the cable that came from the battery, which was in the back, to the master switch. Well, it didn't. It just went bypass that, and the master switch and the leads for that were all hidden underneath. But that's what it looked like. So, like at Brands Hatch, I did this giant burnout because the weather was cold, and twice. I mean, I was the center of attention. I mean, this looked like a pro stock burnout. Across the line, both times. The reason I could do that was I took my vice grips, clamped off the back brake, like that. Burnout, burnout. When I made the start, I had hot tires, everyone had cold tires. That was the meeting where I went from 28th to joint first before the first corner at Brands. Now, I'm driving a 1600cc car, that's 97 inches. The front two rows were populated by V8 cars like Camaros or Mustangs or whatever. Well, I arrived at turn 1 between the two pole position, front row position setting Camaros. The commentator didn't talk about anybody else. I remember, no, I didn't hear this. I remember somebody said, he said, "Look at Vizar go." Well, I'm sure I would attract attention going through the field. The funny part was when I came around next time, there were 3 cars on cranes which had crashed due to me going through. I must have been going 15 miles an hour faster than they were at the time, maybe more, right? But there's also another trick that I used. I had a stopwatch on my dash, and when the 1 minute light went off, right, I hit the timer, the stopwatch, and then I watched it come round, and I knew that the time it took me to register from the clock, the light, to hitting the stopwatch was pretty much 1 second. When I came up to the line, my crew chief made sure that I was at least 6 or 7 inches, my wheel was at least 6 or 7 inches behind. The start of the race is when you cross that line. If you're behind it and you start moving, that's not considered a false start. They take a picture, boom, of the start when that light goes green. So if you're behind that light, you haven't made a false start. Well, I would hit that line going probably 2 miles an hour. Now, somebody on that race, standing on the wall, said to me, they couldn't believe it. They said, "When you left the line, I saw about 3 inches, may have been 2 inches of daylight under your front wheel." That's how fast I left the line. This is a circuit car. I left the line about the same as I used to on Santa Pod drag strip. Anyway, that was another move. Now there was one, oh yes, that was it, the clamping the deal there. Very last one here, roll bar. I managed to get the roll bar settings such that I didn't have to change, I say roll bar, I should have said sway bar. In England it's called an anti-roll bar. Over here it's an anti-sway bar. Whereas the factory team changed their roll bar, sway bar size for the track and for the weather, mine was the same one every time. And my car outhandled theirs. And here's how I did it. 2 things. Firstly, I managed to avoid using a proper fuel tank, i.e. a foam-filled rubber reservoir type thing that you put in the trunk. I managed to talk the chief tech guy, Peter, can't remember his last name, great guy he was, I remember that. Very, very accommodating so long as he couldn't see any illegality in it. I said, "Look, I can't afford all this expensive rubber system fuel tanks. What do I have to do to make my stock tank legal?" And he says, "You've got to encase that son of a bitch in enough fiberglass casing to ensure that it won't break in the event of a crash, unless it's some god-awful crash that would have killed you anyway rather than split the tank." So we did. Now the back of my car, the rear valance came down a curve like this, and the way it was stock was the air would come in and it would cause all this lift at the back. So if you had a fast track, you had to have a roll bar that induced more understeer at the front, and on a slow track you had to have a roll bar which induced more oversteer. Now what I did, or what me and my guys did, we built this enormously thick fiberglass case, which extended right back to the valance. So the fiberglass case itself was so big, it actually acted as an aerodynamic aid at the back. So instead of the air coming up and getting caught in the valance and lifting the car, it flowed out. It was like a, what's the word for it? A diffuser. It flowed out. And here's the thing, the car handled exactly the same at high speed as it did at low speed. So I ended up with this roll bar, which we figured was the right one, and the only adjustment we made was between wet and dry. Here's what I did. The rod, the push rods that go from the suspension to the roll bar have these rubber cones either side of them, and you just tighten them up. Now, you can tighten these up so they're very tight, which engages the roll bar quickly, or you can tighten them up just so much, which engages the roll bar slowly. In the wet, you need to have a situation where the car can roll easier, because it gives you an indication of how fast you're taking the corner. If you've got a rock solid stiff car, you have no visual means of seeing how fast you're cornering, only by the seat of your pants. And the trouble is when it's wet, very often the seat of your pants tells you, oh, you've just lost it. That's too late. Doing these soft ones, very soft, I used to have about, could be 8 3/16 of free play before it hit the rubber. So when the car first went into the corner, it had no roll bar, front or rear. It just rolled on the springs. Then it started to take up the roll bar progressively. It worked great. However, it does make the assumption you know how to drive it, but it worked great. On dry tracks with a lot of grip, where you could flip the car, they were done up tight, so that when the car started to roll, the roll bar was right there. Right, I think that's enough driving tips for this. I'm sure I've got a lot more I can tell you, but that's going to be enough for this edition of PowerTec 10. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment. I want your comments. Notify, and if you look on your screen, you will see a little green sign which said support St. Jude's. You just punch it, put it in an amount. The reason I've done this is I'm going to see if I can convince everybody I know to put one of these at the end of their deal. So we've got $10 so far as of the time I'm doing this. Guys, let's see if we can make this $100 by September 18th. That's only a week away. Let's see if we can do it. You get the pleasure out of doing your stuff here. There's a bunch of kids which would love to be in your position doing their stuff with race cars, right? They may not make it. Some of them might make it with your help. It's called a grief relief, because I don't want parents to go through what I want when I lost Jackie. So please take note of that. Anyway, don't forget the sale coming up. That will be Saturday. I will talk to you next time. Thank you.